Good morning, everyone. Hope you're all doing well and having a lovely Wednesday morning. My name is Ryan Brick, and I will be your presenter today and taking you through Section 12J of the Income Tax Act and giving you some insights as to JALTEC as a business, as well as Section 12J as a piece of legislation, as perhaps tax mechanism to assist certain clients with income tax liabilities or capital gains tax liabilities. This is a really efficient way of offsetting that. We'll kickstart the presentation. If you would like, you can ask questions, post the questions in the chat box on the right hand side, and I will do my best to get to these questions, and I'll get to all of them towards the end of the presentation. So we'll save all the questions for the end and go from there. Great. So as I mentioned, my name is Ryan Brick. I work as a fund manager for a company, JALTEC, and we specialize in Section 12J of the Income Tax Act. Very much to SA Accounting Academy for hosting me this morning. We really appreciate it. Just some background information to SA Accounting Academy, just to get started. And for your references, this presentation will be recorded and will be made available to all registered and attended guests. A bit of more information about myself, being the presenter. As I mentioned, my name is Ryan Brick. I've been working for a company, JALTEC, as a fund manager for over 4 years now. I have relevant private equity experience across different industries within the economy, which include private equity, renewable energy, property, movable assets, etc. There's various other industries which I have exposure to. As well as prior to joining JALTEC, I've built a foundation of private equity experience. And in terms of my qualifications, I completed a Bachelor of Business Science. I majored in finance and accounting at UCT. I then went on to do my tax honors at UCT, whereby I wrote a technical thesis in Section 12J of the Income Tax Act. And that is what brought me to work in the industry. That's just a bit of background to myself and what I focus in. Give you some indication of the structure of the presentation of today. It's going to break it down into 4 different modules. Module 1 will be what is Section 12J, just to understand what is this section of the Income Tax Act and how does the tax benefits specifically work. Module 2 will be Section 12J rules, so all rules associated with Section 12J investments, as well as Section 12J funds to be aware of. Then just some relevant information on the market as to where the market is currently sitting at. And then fourthly, just some relevant information as to some of the funds and the funding offer, the fund management offerings, which JALTEC has as a business, which may be of interest. So we're going to get started with module number 1, which is what is Section 12J? Module number 1, what is Section 12J? So Section 12J is this section in the Income Tax Act of South Africa. Effectively, in the Income Tax Act, if you have to scroll to Section 12 and go to letter J, it would state this piece of legislation. Effectively, what this legislation is, it was introduced in Treasury in 2009, but it received very limited uptake until about 2017, and at that point in time, the industry really exponentially grew and seen as where it is today. The intention behind the legislation was ultimately to create jobs and to incentivize taxpayers to invest into the local economy, which ultimately was required to provide equity finance to small to medium-sized businesses. That was the intention behind the legislation. This is a legislation that was adapted according to a UK context. So this piece of legislation is a UK-based legislation, and it has been adapted according to a South African context. So it's a multi-billion pound incentive in the UK, where there are similar regimes as well around the world, such as countries like Australia, Canada, America, Germany, Switzerland, Israel. These developed economies have very similar local investment reliefs, which ultimately stimulate the economy using local high net worth and taxpayers. The incentive is in the form of a tax incentive. It's in the form of a tax benefit, effectively a tax deduction. We'll explain effectively how that works. That's the rationale and what it is and what Section 12J effectively means, the ethics or the morale behind it. What is a Section 12J VCC? So you may have seen this name, VCC. It stands for Venture Capital Company. Venture Capital Company has a term behind it that requires, or not requires, is labeled as investors or funds investing into ventures, into startups. This is a name given to the legislation. It is a misnomer. There's no requirement for a Section 12J company to only invest into startups. And I'll explain what the legislation states and the requirements thereof. Effectively, as a 12J VCC, as a company, one can either have a Section 12J PTY limited company or a traditional limited company. The difference here is whether the company is deemed a public entity or a private entity. If the company is deemed a private entity, it can only by law accept funding of 1 million rand or more from investors. If the company is a public company, which most Section 12Js are, these are unlisted public entities. They are not listed 12 listed entities. Effectively, what that means is a Section 12J VCC can accept funding of any amount less than 1 million rand per investor. When a Section 12J VCC, how does it obtain its license? How does it have the approvals in order to issue what is referred to as 12J shares? When we register a 12J company, effectively what we do is we register a PTY limited company. We then go to the FSCA, which used to be the FSB, and we register it as an FSP provider. This is a Category 1 FSP licensed fund. And once we get that approval and we obtain that license, we then go to SARS and register and approve it as an approved venture capital company. Once it has those double regulations and it has those stamps of approvals, this fund is labeled as a Section 12J VCC, and it is enabled by the fund manager to issue 12J shares, which allow the investors to claim a deduction against their taxable income. There's two sorts of fund structures in the market. One is called a pooled VCC, whereas one is called a ring-fenced VCC. Your pooled VCC is your most common Section 12J fund structure, where there is an appointed fund manager that the investors invest into the fund, and the fund manager has discretion over sourcing investments which fit the fund's mandate and effectively provide the investors with returns and a diversified exposure to the underlying businesses. This is, very common, and they can, in an alternative word, be called a third-party fund or a vanilla fund. Your ring-fence structure is less common in Section 12J, but it is still very common. This is where you have a group of investors that identify an opportunity and they utilize the 12J structure in order to invest into an opportunity of their choice and effectively use the 12J as the structure or the alternative route to do so as a tax-efficient structure. Great, so I'm going to move on. The next part of the slide will just give you an indication of what an example of a basic structure looks like. This is an example of a pooled VCC structure or a vanilla structure, which I was referring to in my previous slide. This is a fund that we have under management. It's called Infinity Anchor Fund, just to use as an example. The investors would invest into Infinity. They're a fund manager like myself, which is appointed on an Infinity. And the investors obviously would then receive their income tax deduction once they make their Section 12J investment. And then the fund manager would have discretion over managing the entire pool of investors' capital and sourcing different investments which fit Infinity's mandate. And that's effectively how the fund works. When these investments yield dividends, the dividends would then be paid to Infinity, which would ultimately then be yielded or earned or paid to the investors directly.
I hope that you enjoyed that video. For more of our webinar videos, go to www.accountingacademy.co.za. Thank you and have a lovely day.